Season 4 of the Missing Witches podcast is lovingly sponsored by our Patreon patrons, thank you, and Foxglove Farm. Go to foxglovefarm.com and use offer code MissingWitches for 13% off your order.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Hello to the Missing Witches Coven, to all of you who are my safe space, your ears, the places outside my home, my temple where my voice travels, through forests and thickets carried over these waves to find its home in your heart. You hear me. I thank you. Today's episode is unlike most because you've almost 100% heard of our featured witch. But the missing part of Missing Witches comes in many forms. In American history, Harriet Tubman's story is oft told. A hero of civil rights, a literal trailblazer, railroad conductor, freedom fighter whose face was set to appear on the American $20 bill, making her the only woman and the only black person to hold such a distinction. It was supposed to happen in 2020, but has unsurprisingly been pushed to 2028. Monuments, schools, museums, and libraries, even a U.S. military ship bear her name. So for sure I'd heard of Harriet Tubman. What I had not heard was that she was a witch. The missing part for me in Harriet's story is the witch part. So we'll be hitting some key biographical points, but today we'll mostly go looking for the witch part we've been missing. Born in Maryland, born into slavery, born to a mother who was born into slavery. Born Araminta Ross, Harriet went by the nickname Minty. I'll be using this nickname from time to time because, like Pamela Coleman Smith and Pixie, the word minty is just delightful to say. Minty. So tasty. Invigorating. A cool burn. Refreshing. Plus, Minty was often the name that appeared on wanted posters. It reminds me that Harriet was an outlaw. She is, of course, considered a hero now, but then there was a bounty on her head. Minty's grandmother had been stolen from Africa and purchased by an Eastern Shore family named Pattison. Included in the price were her next 2 generations. At one time, Minty prayed and prayed for her owner, and it's so hard not to choke on the word owner here. Minty prayed and prayed for her owner to die, and he died. The death of a slave owner provided no relief for the enslaved, though. Like any other object or property, enslaved people were inherited by the next generation or given as gifts. Children born to enslaved mothers became more property. As Minty found, even if a deceased's will gave her her freedom, she still had little recourse to enforce these wishes. It's repugnant to think that this hellscape was normal, but that's what normalization does. To calibrate our moral compass, we must question the status quo and the ulterior motives behind what we are told. Witches are outlaws. I hope I don't need to get into the horrific details of slavery to stir your emotion, to paint bloody landscapes as backdrops for torture porn. This is not a true crime podcast, though many have been killed for the crime of witchcraft, and systemic slavery is for certain the truest crime. We know our history, y'all. We see it echoing through American racism today. I'm not going to focus on the gory details of physical violence here because it seems like for Minty, the most abominable cruelty of slavery was the physical and psychological violence of the separation of families. Her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad stemmed from her wanting to put her own family back together. As I said, human beings were treated as objects, bought, sold, traded at will. Minty's sister was sold. Minty knew that she herself would be next. It's said that Minty had visions, prophetic dreams, and nightmares that came true. Some will argue that these were mere hallucinations brought out by a traumatic brain injury incurred at age 12 or 13 when a slaveholder cracked her skull with a pot. Further goes the story that the pot hit her because she stepped between the projectile and its intended victim. Even before the injury, she was willing to stick her neck out for the protection of others. So I'll ask you, dear witches, did this braining make her crazy, or did it open up her mind to a gift? We could ask this question of many strong, powerful, determined female leaders who were painted as hysterical or burned at the stake, visions chalked up to psychosis or the devil. Joan of Arc comes to mind. So I'll leave it to you to decide for yourself. Harriet Tubman had well-documented prophetic visions. Was she insane? or gifted. Harriet is often called a conjure woman, which is great for the purposes of this podcast, but was she? And what does that mean? In Working Conjure, Hudson Moise writes, the short answer would be that conjure is an African-American-based magical practice that contains influences from African spiritual practices, Christianity, Jewish mysticism, and Native American practices, as well as European folk magic. However, Moise continues, the primary influence derives from the spiritual beliefs of Central and West Africa. If you'd like to know more about the African origins of these traditions, check out our Mama Lola episode from season 1, or better yet, pick up a copy of Ona Agbani, The Ancient Path by Ayalosa Akalatunde, and follow Ayalosa on Instagram at got2beocean. Walter Rucker wrote, among slaves at least, conjurers were respected not solely because of the apprehension of their powers inspired. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, these spiritualists had multifaceted and multidimensional functions in the slave community. At any given time, the conjurer could be the healer of the sick, the interpreter of the unknown, the comforter of the sorrowing, the supernatural avenger of the wrong. It would be through many of these roles that African conjurers helped to encourage slave resistance throughout the Americas. So, let's go through the checklist. Healer of the sick. Check. Harriet was a Civil War nurse who used her knowledge of plants to cure or ease discomfort. Interpreter of the unknown. Check. Harriet spoke to God and had absolute faith in the messages she received. Comforter of the sorrowing. Check. Supernatural avenger of the wrong. Check, 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 check. In his book, Conjuring Harriet Mama Moses Tubman, Witch Dr. Utu says, her seemingly supernatural powers, psychic visions, incantations, and unique cures were the stuff of a conjure woman. She continued to be an almost ghost-like entity to those in the slave states, who feared her and her supernatural ways. She was known to come out of her trances and dreams with knowledge of an ambush that lay in wait and change course, and they would come to find out later that there had indeed been an ambush waiting. Divining by animal activity, clouds, rocks, and bones, as well as her dreams and visions, she reputedly carried a gourd as a container housing roots and herbs that she would shake in certain times of need. Utu wrote of Harriet's lifetime, an entire continent was divided when it came to slavery. And I had to stop here and lay the book down on the table when I read this line because it reverberated in such a contemporary way. I feel crazy when I look around and I see how polarized our society is. Then I remember that in 1861 there were enough Americans against the abolition of slavery that were willing to fight against their own countrymen to protect their right to own slaves to start a civil war that would go on for years. Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th illustrates how, with the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery in America did not end, but rather was renamed, repackaged into mass incarceration. The New York Times podcast series 1619 examines the long shadow of American slavery. Both are excellent resources to understand how this history informs our present. In 2020, as we mourn George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, when we had not yet finished mourning Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Fred Hampton, we still need to say Black Lives Matter, and when we do, we are painted as radicals. When we point out injustice, we are snowflakes. So let's conjure Minty, who just did what her gut told her was right, who helped people, who was brave and never gave up hope or the fight. She used the North Star as a literal and metaphorical guide, so when we witches need to snatch some hope from the baffling despair of this 2020, we can look there too. Utu writes, the North Star was sung to and wished upon as the great navigator those on the Underground Railroad looked to guide them out of bondage and point the way north. To stand beneath and draw the light of the North Star down upon us is a central sacred work with the spirits of the Underground Railroad. The North Star is a mirror that still reflects back to us the very eyes of those who gaze up toward it in prayer, vow, panic, and for some, eventual joy. For many who fled on the tracks of freedom, this was the only aid they had. No other codes, mysteries, or promise of friends waiting farther down the line was there for them to hold on to. Just the hope that somehow it would all work out. The North Star was the encourager to keep going, the comforter from above. A devoted eye of the ancestors looking down upon their people with love. This holiest celestial mystery, definitive of the Underground Railroad and its legacy. The North Star's ability to house and reflect back to us that which was conjured into it. Yes, the freedom seeker used it to navigate. It was a symbol and code among friends and supporters, immortalized as a holy light for those greatest achievements of self-emancipation ever known. But it was also a mirror, and a mirror retains all that it captures. For every victorious moment of a freedom seeker standing upon his or her metaphorical land of Canaan across the borderline of the River Jordan, gazing upon her with unfathomable joy, there is also sadness too. How does one find words to describe the level of sadness and tragedy retained and reflected back? We can look at the North Star with dry eyes and praise its heavenly light and all that it stood for. But all her mysteries must be grappled with, for she also captures forever the last moments of those who were not successful, whose tear-filled eyes gazed one last time at their comforter before their life was stolen away. So there, in the sky, my witches, the North Star acknowledges pain and still encourages us to move forward. It was there before gender reveal party wildfires or COVID-19 or racism. It was there before industry, war, or even greed. It is that self-same star that shone on Minty as she won the freedom of her brethren that shines on us today. It is still there if we look up. When Minty had first successfully fought and found her way to a form of freedom, so not like safety, of course, but in less peril, when she had successfully done that, she decided to turn around, go back, and show others the way. Human North Star that she was. I gotta ask, how many of us, after a hard-fought battle, go straight back into danger? I'm going to hop around on the timeline here because while most of us picture Harriet skulking through the woods by moonlight, which she did do, and there's definitely an air of witchcraft in that, she also led military battles, earning the sobriquet General Tubman from freedom fighter John Brown. When he needed to feel her presence, he would call out her name 3 times as invocation, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman. In one instance, Minty led a Union gunship's successful Confederate raid on the Combahee River. As Erica Armstrong Dunbar describes in her book, She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. Eventually, Minty came to liken her rescuing of individuals to removing grains of sand from a beach. With the Civil War, she saw an opportunity to clear the whole beach forever. Erica Armstrong Dunbar wrote, and I'm just going to read you this paragraph and let it hang in the air for you to draw your own subtext. Erica wrote, Harriet's raid on the Combahee dealt a devastating blow to Confederacy, causing nearly $2 million in property damage and the loss of hundreds of slaves. Harriet became the first woman, black or white, to plan and lead an armed military expedition during the Civil War. Her strategy supported a form of combat new to the Civil War, a type of scorched earth warfare that left nothing to chance. In Harriet's mind, everything about slavery needed to be destroyed, and she felt no pity over the loss of property or Confederate life. Having come face to face with their cruelty, she knew that Southern slaveholders would never voluntarily end human bondage. They would need to be canceled out. Black troops stared into the faces of Confederate soldiers with a fierce preparedness, reminding everyone, from the cooks in the Union camps up to Abraham Lincoln, that they were more than able to fight. They were hungry for victory, and under Harriet's leadership, they would find it. Let's get back to Minty the Witch. Harriet was a shapeshifter and a master of disguise. To evade bounty hunters, she would dress as an old woman or farm laborer, in drag as a man. She would hold a newspaper in front of her face, not just to shield her infamous visage, but also because it was well known that the outlaw could not read. Now, here's a great place to stop for a patented missing witches tangent to rage a little bit about intellectual superiority. It's pretentious, obnoxious, and arrogant to think that you can determine a person's worth by their level of fancy book learning, or determine their intelligence by their proper or improper use of grammar. I'll go one step further. It's classist and racist and sexist. Poor people, people of color, women have historically been kept out of formal education, but this did not stop them from having knowledge of their own. And maybe more importantly, ideas. Don't get me wrong, I'm a language junkie, and when I was a kid, I was a little shit, and a real stickler for proper grammar, a condescending 9-year-old brat who wanted to prove that I was not only smart, but smarter than you. Thanks be to the great unknown, I grew out of that pretentious way of thinking, but guess what? Some people never do. But guess what else? Emoji are a language. Ave is a language. Oral traditions, obviously, the whole starting point. Language is a living thing whose rules, beyond those of clear communication, are arbitrary. To think otherwise is what fancy book learners call linguistic discrimination. So for me, if your ideas are good, I don't give a fuck if your participle is dangling. I'd be crazy to care, because Harriet Tubman could not read. And yet there is no doubt in my mind that she was smarter, braver, more knowledgeable, and more magical than I could ever hope to be, no matter how many letters I acquire after my name. Listen now, witches. If you ever think, or dear Lord forbid, if anyone ever tells you that you're not educated enough to make a difference, that your vocabulary is not grand enough for your voice to have value, you know the type, can be found dismissively saying shit like, oh, you've never read Dostoevsky? Remind them and yourself that Harriet Tubman could not read. And yet, ideas. Maybe you haven't read a ton of books. Maybe you're the next Harriet Tubman. And now, a word from our sponsor. You all remember Foxglove Farm from our last season. We are so stoked to be working with Sammy again and with Foxglove Farm.
Yeah, this incredible witch in her kitchen makes just such beautiful product and like inspiring things that I've actually used all the time that really touch my life. I use the So Moted tea all the time, and I use the calming one too, the anxiety. They're beautiful. They're perfect for my workings at home. And she's just a pleasure and delight. So we really are excited to work with her again, and excited for you guys to get an opportunity to discover her witchy boxes. Right.
These subscription boxes, it's like a combination of things you can keep. Like my box had like a little incense plate in it, and, you know, artwork, stuff like that, but also things you can consume like soap and tea. Foxglove works with witchy artisans and puts their stuff into the boxes. It's all ethically sourced.
We like it. We love her. We hope you check it out and make use of that sweet, sweet listener offer code, Missing Witches, for 13% off your order.
Whether or not you believe in deities, faith in something outside yourself can give you courage that you might not otherwise be able to muster. I've said before that faith is the opposite of anxiety. The overarching sense that with faith, things will be okay, or conversely with anxiety, definitely not okay. But Minty's faith empowered her. Friend and abolitionist Thomas Garrett said of her, I never met any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God. So her faith empowered her, and then she, in turn, empowered others. As her story spread, and tales were spun and respun, this renown grew her supernatural reputation, inspiring other enslaved people to have capital F faith in her, and hope for their freedom. Faith and hope are like that. They spread and grow exponentially. On the freedom trails of the Underground Railroad, Minty found safe passageways through seemingly impenetrable forests and rivers. The Old Testament tells that God chose Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. One of Moses' most legendary acts was the parting of the Red Sea, where he and God moved the waters to create a path for the Israelites to walk to freedom. So you can see how easily Minty's friend, abolitionist and suffragist William Lloyd Garrison was able to draw parallels between these stories, giving Minty the nickname Moses. Mama Moses. She was also sometimes known as Black Moses, but as we'll get into a little later, the OG Moses was most likely also black, so I prefer Mama. As W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, one of the characteristics of magical mystical conjure women is to be a, quote, healer of the sick. Erica Armstrong Dunbar describes how Minty used her knowledge of plants and roots to rise through the ranks of the Union Army. Erica wrote, She gained trust by performing some of the most important work among the soldiers and the freedmen. She was drafted to nurse the sick and console the dying. Harriet was assigned to work with Dr. Henry K. Durant, a physician and medical director of the Freedmen's Hospital in Port Royal, where she witnessed unimaginable suffering. More men would die of disease than bullets during the war, as yellow fever and cholera turned healthy men into mere shadows of themselves. Dysentery wreaked havoc in the intestines of men who languished in unsanitary conditions as flies, feces, and food carried germs that wiped out entire regiments and caused devastation among the civilian population. There were only a handful of available medications that treated diseases, so the sick depended on botanical concoctions. Harriet would have collected blackberries and brewed chamomile tea to soothe inflamed bowels. She also remembered that paregoric, which she used to drug fugitive babies, served as an antidiarrheal. Appreciated for her knowledge of herbal remedies, Harriet continued to gain the trust and admiration of the freedmen and freedwomen around the camp. Among the formerly enslaved, her knowledge carried more weight than the advice of Dr. Durand. She was well known for her underground leadership, but in the camps she became legendary for her medical care. If you're particularly interested in this relationship between witch and nurse, I, for probably the 100th time on this podcast, recommend Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Deirdre English and Barbara Ehrenreich. Minty said, "I prayed to God to make me strong and able to fight, and that's what I've always prayed for ever since." My family used to say, "Don't ask God for a lighter load. Ask for a stronger back." Because here's the thing, terrible stuff is probably going to happen and we can't control it. What we can control is our faith in ourselves to withstand. A strong back will carry whatever load and keep walking. As Harriet kept walking, her most major talisman was the Bible. For those of you who are just learning about the craft through this podcast, a talisman is pretty much just any object that you believe has special power. A good luck charm. Utu wrote, and I love this so much, Tubman took most of her biblical inspiration from the Old Testament with its focus on deliverance and was not fond of the narrative contained in the New Testament, feeling it promoted obedience among the enslaved. Very shrewd, Minty. Let's examine something from Jesus' most famous speech, the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, "If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well." So we can view this as a beautiful statement of pacifism, nonviolence, zen, and the absence of greed, but we also clearly see how words like this could be easily manipulated by slave traders to imply that submission to oppression is the only path to salvation. I grew up in the church. I was in the choir and the youth group. I did the 40-hour famine on Christian retreats. I was lucky. We were Presbyterian, not fanatical. My mom is a Christian to the core, but she's progressive, feminist. But she's also been brainwashed into a sense of Christian superiority. That Muslims are good people, but sadly, they won't get into heaven. That hers is the way, the truth, and the light. That the only way into heaven is to formally accept Jesus Christ into your heart. And so on, and so on, and so on. As she gets older and her memory fades and her body breaks down, she clings more and more to her faith. She prays and prays and prays because according to her rules and regulations, I'm not going to heaven either. I ask how it could be heaven if your most loved ones can't be there with you. For this, she has no answer. My mom understands that I didn't leave the church because of Christ. I left because of Christians. I came of age during the AIDS crisis and found it impossible to justify turning your back on your children or the sick because Leviticus kind of hints that being gay is abomination. The Christ that lived in my heart was not this. I found it impossible to justify an allegiance to anyone who would invoke his name to protest women's rights. I began to see missionaries not as saviors, but as the front line of colonialism, a Trojan horse shaped like love and forgiveness with extermination hidden inside. So, I quit the church and joined Amnesty International and the local AIDS committee. The goal was to be less Christian and more Christ-like. My mother understands all this, but she still thinks I'm going to hell. Nonetheless, because of my upbringing, Jesus is my default deity. When I'm in agony, his is the name I instinctually beg for relief. It took some time, but I no longer feel conflicted about my Christian heritage, having decided that Jesus was a witch. a conjureman who overturned the moneylenders' tables in the temples and befriended outcasts. And yet, it remained difficult for me to envision the Bible as anything more than a tool for white supremacy and religious hegemony. And then I met Harriet Tubman, and through her, I met the Bible again. Because Harriet had a direct line with God, she didn't need to believe the preachers who told her that submission was the path to heaven. She spoke to God without the need for self-interested translators. Still, there's a lot of Christian media that will tout Minty's image and quote her reverence for the Lord. It got to the point where I wondered how Minty would feel about me placing her in this pantheon of magical, mystical, powerful, missing witches. After all, Exodus 22:18 does say, "Thou shalt not suffer witch to live." And then I remembered something, and every bit of this story fell into place. If you practice conjure or hoodoo, maybe you've been listening and thinking this all along. In Mules and Men, Zora Neale Hurston wrote, "All hold that the Bible is the great conjure book of the world." And there it was. I was looking outside of her Christianity for Harriet's witchcraft, but it turns out that the Bible was her spell book all along, as it is for many. So I went looking and found Sherry Schoen, aka That Hoodoo Lady, and her book, The Hoodoo Guide to the Bible. You'll meet Sherry on our next episode in a couple days and fall in love with her like I did, I'm sure. So I'll keep the discussion of her book somewhat brief here. I'll just read you a few choice excerpts that we'll return to in our interview later this week. Sherry wrote, "In the beginning, there was Africa. According to historians, the cradle of civilization, Africa, began forming agriculture around 6,000 years before Common Era BCE. The book, The Africans Who Wrote the Bible, by author Nana Banshee Darkwa, carefully guides the readers to understand that there are well-known fallacies of Bible knowledge. The Bible that is known as Jewish Hebrew came from generations of Africans. Systematic politics and racism caused 2,000 years of miseducation of our religious leaders because they did not want the Bible origins to have started with African roots. However, if you consider that even the names of biblical characters such as Adonai and Yahweh are African names, you may see the truth. Even Adam, yes, that Adam, was African. His death is said to have occurred in 3045 BCE. Can you imagine him having a European name of Adam 3,000 years ago in BCE Africa? Neither can I. Sherry goes on. Noah's flood around 2300 BCE had to have occurred in Africa and with Africans of darker color. King Solomon in the Bible is described in chapter 1, verse 5, Song of Solomon. I am black. I am black because the sun hath looked upon me. Sherry says, if Solomon was black, then all those before him were as well. And elsewhere, Sherry writes, I have come to appreciate the magic of simplicity. I use common ingredients for uncommonly good results. The slaves that held to the beliefs of their native land knew in their hearts and spirits that their ancestors would provide them everything they needed. They looked for medicinal remedies in trees, plants, seeds, roots, and animals. These same beliefs transferred to Africans who came to America and began their path in the southern states. They brought the traditions of their native religions and merged them with new belief systems of their owners. For the slaves on the property, they used their knowledge of roots and herbs and combined them with chants, prayers, and Bible verses. Sherry Schoen, That Hoodoo Lady, also writes that the Bible is one of these common ingredients, available in many homes, most hotel rooms, any bookshop. For those of you, and I'm especially looking at our queer, slutty, or otherwise blasphemous coven members here who felt personally victimized by the Bible and rightfully cry out, fuck that Bible noise, Sherry and her wife have something for you too. Sherry has a magic that she calls turning a hurtful Bible verse into a helpful exercise. I'm all for reclaiming and recontextualizing things that used to hurt us, so I hope you'll all come back for Wednesday's episode where I speak to Sherry herself specifically about reframing and reclaiming this book that may have hurt us. In her book, Black Magic, Yvonne Chiraud, whom you heard in an interview with Risa on the podcast earlier this season, reminds us that it was not unusual for practitioners of conjure to profess their simultaneous commitment to Christianity. One of my favorite rappers, KRS-One, has his own take on the Bible. In a freestyle, he said, and don't worry, I'm not going to rap, but I did transcribe this from the audio, so definitely hit me up if I got something wrong here. KRS-One said, "Listen to the lyric. We are the ones prophesied to return. My main concern is for all of you to learn how to live. Yes, through the lyrics I give and send, my friend, this age is coming to an end. Not the world, but the age is ending. Listen to the astrological message I'm sending. Truth is truth whether or not you like me. We are living now in the age of Pisces, but Pisces is over at the year 2000 when the Son of God changes his house and enters the age of Aquarius. The Son of God as man is hilarious. When you think of Jesus, think of the sun. The flaming sun, that's where they stole this concept from. Stop believing and read your Bible logically. The New Testament is really old astrology. Jesus is the Son of God, no lie, but they might be talking about the sun up in the sky. The sun. It hangs on the cross of the zodiac with 12 signs to be exact. Each sign is a house, and you should keep in mind, each house equals a period of time. The time 2,000 years, and that's a fact, it's called an age or a house in the zodiac. The 12 disciples are 12 months of reason. The 4 Gospels signify the 4 seasons. When Jesus fed the multitude with 2 fishes, it signified the age of Pisces, not fish on dishes. If you read the Bible astrologically, it's clearer. The next age will be the age of the water bearer. It's called the age of Aquarius, when logic and truth will take care of us. So in this age of spiritual dignity, you'll see a rise in femininity and creativity meshed with masculinity. You got to get with me. This is your true herstory. So that's what Who Knew He Was a Witch KRS-One thinks. You can find his vastly superior performance of these words in the show notes for this episode or by searching 4th Quarter Free Throws on YouTube. Back to Harriet. Asked whether she would actually kill a reluctant escapee, she replied, yes. If he was weak enough to give out, he'd be weak enough to betray us all, and all who had helped us. And do you think I'd let so many die just for one coward man? According to her biographer, Earl Conrad, she said, you go on or you die. One way or another, you'll be free. That said, she never lost a single freedom seeker. Not one person died or was lost on her watch. So I encourage you to be the town bitch, witch. If it's for a good cause, don't let politeness get in your way. There's a great quote in the TV show Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. I'm always amazed at what women will do because they're afraid of being rude. So for the greater good, my witches, with Minty in mind, be rude. Don't wait for the approval of cowards. Speaking of politeness, I'm Canadian, so sorry about it. I can't let y'all get away before we talk about Minty's time in Canada. First thing, Minty settled in a town called St. Catharines in Ontario. Now, I grew up just a couple hours drive from St. Catharines, but I didn't know this. It's worth noting that Witch Dr. Utu, whose book I've been quoting, lives in St. Catharines, so I want to thank him again for shouting all this information from his St. Catharines rooftop. Now, imagine something. You're a freedom seeker. You've walked hundreds of miles from the south, hunted and afraid. Finally, you reach Canada. But instead of milk and honey, you find snow and ice. Erica Armstrong Dunbar wrote, many runaways eventually found work as laborers and servants for the affluent families or as cooks and maids for local hotels. But getting their new lives on track would prove far from easy. When Harriet and her followers arrived at St. Catharines, they were without proper food or clothing to get them through the difficult winter. They struggled to find housing and security and were relegated to the same kinds of difficult agriculture and manual labor that they had known all too well. Except this time, they had to complete their tasks in blinding snowstorms and frigid temperatures. They tried to ignore the prickling feeling in their fingers and toes as they chopped wood in the icy forests of Ontario, but surviving the cold proved extremely challenging. Their exposed faces left noses and cheeks vulnerable to frostbite as they chopped and collected cords of wood to be sold at market. Frostbitten toes and ears turned white and quickly developed fluid-filled blisters that burned like fire. The fugitives would have learned that in severe cases, frostbite could turn the skin black and deaden the tissue. Toes and fingers would simply fall off, leaving a person disabled for life. These were hard lessons to learn, lessons that might have made the runaways reconsider the journey they'd made from the Eastern Shore. Homesickness presented these new Canadians with another set of challenges. Memories of parents, children, spouses, and friends who remained in Maryland haunted the men and women who took a chance with Harriet, and they mourned their losses while balancing new survival strategies. They also had to embrace the reality that they were free from slavery but still bound by racism, which caused Harriet and her band of newcomers to tread lightly on their new land. But here's how we know that they wouldn't trade anything for their journey. No matter how homesick, tired, regretful, or hungry they may have been, none of them ever returned to the farms that exploited their bodies as beasts of burden. Harriet stated later in her life, "I have seen hundreds of escaped slaves, but I never saw one who was willing to go back and be a slave." Harriet remained with her brother in St. Catharines during the winter of 1852, surviving the season with the help of local friends and allies who were committed to helping fugitives. Her niece, Keziah, whom she had rescued, and Keziah's husband, John Bowley, also left Philadelphia and traveled north to resettle in Canada with their family members. By spring, Harriet had recovered her energy and was ready to head back to the United States to make some money and plan additional trips back to Maryland. Her network in Philadelphia helped her find work, and she headed back down to the resort town of Cape May, New Jersey, to work as a cook for wealthy white families. Once she had saved enough money and the autumn leaves had started to fall, Harriet planned her next rescue and returned to the Eastern Shore of Maryland yet again. We don't know the names of those she helped, but Harriet returned to Canada with 9 more fugitives. This became a pattern for the conductor. She would work during the summer and save as much money as possible. At some point during the fall, she would travel back to Maryland to save another group of runaways. By 1854, Harriet had made at least 5 trips back to the Eastern Shore and had rescued close to 30 enslaved people. During the winter, the conductor pulled off one of her most daring rescues. She arranged to bring her brothers Henry, Benjamin, and Robert Ross out of slavery and into the safety of Canada. Harriet the slave, the runaway, the savior, the nurse, the soldier, the spy, the general, the legend, the witch, succumbed to pneumonia on March 10th, 1913, surrounded by friends and family. Shortly before her death, her final words, as quoted by the Auburn Citizen on March 11th, were, "I go to prepare a place for you." Mama Moses was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York, and her grave is a place of pilgrimage and a veritable shrine. "I go to prepare a place for you," she said. We give praise and thanks to the ancestors a lot around here, but Minty reminds us that as activists, as gardeners and artists and organizers, we are giving thanks and praise and blessings to the descendants as well. We are preparing a place, planting trees and ideas that we might not live to see fully bloomed. We keep pushing, and if we can't score, hopefully we've inched the ball a little closer to the goal for our team. In the movie version, Harriet from 2019, Minty arrives in Philadelphia and is advised on how to blend in with the legally free people. Don't be afraid. There are plenty of us here. Walk like you've got a right to. And I think that's good advice for us too, my witches. Don't be afraid. There are plenty of us here. Walk like you've got a right to. Harriet said, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars and change the world." As you go off about planning your future, dreaming your dreams, and preparing a place, take a moment first, tonight, to find and reach for the North Star, or put your face north into the sky. Whisper your hopes and goals to the stars, and let part of your wish be to clear a path that makes the walk easier for everyone who comes after. If you pry open a door, hold it ajar and go back for the next witch, or send a map and tell them how to get there. As Amanda Yates Garcia wrote, in our travels through the underworld, witches become map makers. So make a map. Believe in yourself or believe in something else and let that faith empower you. Strike a deal with the North Star. I'll shine if you will. Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion Reach for the stars to change the world.
You must be a witch.
This episode of the Missing Witches podcast was written and performed by Amy Torek. Music and editing by Amy Torek. Thanks again to our sponsor, Foxglove Farm. Don't forget to use our offer code Missing Witches for 13% off your order. Or make a contribution to their wildlife rescue, Out of the Woods. Find your witchy wellness at Foxglove Farm. That's farm like pharmacy with a ph.com. You can also support Missing Witches on Patreon at patreon.com/missingwitches. And coming soon, Missing Witches t-shirts on TeePublic. And please consider pre-ordering our upcoming book, Missing Witches, by Risa Dickens and Amy Torek, published by North Atlantic Books.